December 24th, 1945, Camp Forest, Tennessee. Ilsa's breath hitched. The tin cup rattled in her hand, spilling lukewarm water onto the rough floorboards. In the lower bunk, Ankie, barely 16, let out a choked whimper and buried her face in the thin mattress. The air in Barrack C was thick with the contradictory smells of lye soap and the sharp, clean scent of pine. A small branch Anke had smuggled in, hidden above the doorframe. Ilsa rose, placing herself between the door and the younger girl. Her eyes darted to the camp regulations tacked to the wall, the ink blurred. Rule 7, no fraternization with guards. The knock came again, louder this time. Ilsa steadied her voice, pitching it just loud enough for Ankie. He is just bringing the list. It is only the list. These quiet moments of shared humanity echo across history. We invite you to subscribe and share which country this story reaches tonight. The latch scraped open. 8 weeks earlier, Atlantic Processing Station, New York. The rattling of the truck's metal bed finally ceased, but the acrid smell of diesel and the close, humid scent of fear remained trapped with them under the canvas. Ilsa kept her grip firm on Anke's wrist. The girl, barely 16, was vibrating, a low, constant hum of terror that Ilsa could feel translating into her own bones. "They are just men, Ankie. Breathe." The words felt like ash in her mouth. She, a trained nurse, knew the mechanisms of fear, yet her own heart hammered against her ribs. The heavy iron bar on the outside of the truck's flap scraped back. Light, gray, and unforgiving flooded the interior, forcing the women to shield their eyes. "Rouse! Out! Move it! Line up single file!" The voice was sharp, like gravel poured onto sheet metal. It belonged to a tall American sergeant, his face set in a mask of profound impatience. He did not look at their faces. He seemed to count them like livestock as they stumbled down onto the wet tarmac. Ilsa pulled Anke with her, steadying the girl as her legs buckled. The ground was solid at least, but the air smelled wrong. It was not the scent of the German forest or the Rhine. This air smelled of coal smoke, salt from the nearby ocean, and something else, something acidic and sharp. "Bags here, coats here, move." The English was a barrier, a wall of noise. Ilsa understood rouse from the war, but the rest was aggressive sound. She watched the women ahead of them, nurses, administrators, factory workers, and civilian support staff swept up in the final collapse, shuffling forward toward a long, single-story wooden building painted a dull olive. This was the processing, the true introduction to their new lives. Inside, the acidic smell intensified until it burned Ilsa's sinuses. Disinfectant, lye soap, and chemical powder. It reminded Ilsa of the chaotic field hospitals after a bombardment. But this was different. This was organized, cold, and utterly impersonal. Undress. Everything in the bins. A female guard, her face devoid of expression, pointed to a row of wooden crates. Anke froze, her hands crossing instinctively over her chest. Ilsa gently turned the girl away from the guard and began to unbutton Anke's frayed woolen coat. "We must, Liebling," she whispered, keeping her voice low and clinical. "It is a medical precaution. It is nothing." But it was not nothing. Ilsa, the former head nurse, tried to see it as a necessary procedure to prevent typhus and lice, as detailed in the conventions she had studied. Yet the methodical coldness of it felt like an erasure. They were showered under streams of lukewarm water that smelled strongly of chlorine, their hair scrubbed, and then dusted by guards wielding bellows filled with a coarse white powder. The clothes they were given in return were stiff, gray, and smelled faintly of the same delousing powder. They were no longer women with names or histories. They were numbers, stenciled in black ink on the backs of the rough work dresses. Everything they had been told, the humiliation, the cold efficiency, the reduction of their humanity, it was true. The propaganda had not lied. Shivering, their damp hair clinging to their necks, they were marched in the fading light to another building. Barrack C. The tall sergeant, Davis, his nameplate read, shoved the door open with his boot. In. It was dark. The weak afternoon light struggled through two small, grime-covered windows at the far end. 10 wooden bunks stacked too high. 10 thin mattresses, the ticking striped with gray and white. The air was heavy with the scent of raw, unseasoned pine and the lingering metallic smell of the potbelly stove, currently cold. Ilsa steered Anke to the farthest corner, claiming a lower bunk for the girl and the top for herself. They sat on the rough wool blankets, listening as the last groups were processed and shoved into the remaining barracks. The sounds from outside, the shouting in English, the rumble of truck engines, slowly faded as a deep, wet cold settled over the camp. A guard walked the length of the barrack, his boots heavy on the floorboards. He stopped at their door, pulling it shut. The heavy thud of the latch dropping into place echoed in the small space, the final, definitive sound of a cage being locked. Darkness in the barrack was not a void. It was a thick, breathing presence. Ilsa lay rigid on the top bunk, every nerve fiber awake. The straw-filled mattress beneath her rustled with every shiver that ran through Anke on the bunk below. Hours passed, marked only by the shifting beam of a searchlight that sliced through the high window, illuminating the ceiling's raw beams for 3 seconds before plunging them back into blackness. The sounds of the camp had muted to a low hum, a distant generator, the wind rattling a loose piece of tin on the roof. Ilsa tried to anchor her mind, to drift back to the sterile quiet of her hospital ward in Hamburg, but the smell of lye and damp wool held her prisoner. Then it came. A sharp, percussive knock that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Below her, Anke's body went taut. A small animal sound escaped her throat. Not a word, just a pure expression of terror. Ilsa swung her legs over the side of the bunk, her bare feet hitting the cold, rough floorboards. She moved automatically, placing her body between the door and the bunk, where Anke was now curled into a tight ball, her face buried in the thin pillow. "Ruhig," Ilsa whispered, her voice cracking. "Quiet." The knock came again, harder this time, vibrating through the wood. Rule 7, no fraternization. But this was not fraternization. This was the midnight summons, the violation they had been warned of, the core of all their propaganda-fueled nightmares. The iron latch scraped back with a sound like a scream. The door flew open, slamming against the interior wall. 2 silhouettes filled the doorway, backlit by the harsh glare of the yard lights. The taller one was Sergeant Davis, his form unmistakable. The other was younger, thinner, a private Ilsa did not recognize. Ilsa raised a hand, a pointless, trembling gesture of defense. Anke let out a high-pitched, piercing shriek. "Quiet!" Davis barked. The younger private flinched at the scream. He was carrying a small cardboard box, a K-ration case. In his surprise, his grip slipped. The box tumbled forward, spilling its contents onto the dusty floor. Cigarettes, canned meat, biscuits, and 3 small, dark brown bars wrapped in paper. The younger soldier, Evans, his helmet stencil read, froze, staring at the mess. He looked mortified. Sergeant Davis let out a string of harsh English words Ilsa could not understand, but their meaning was clear. He was furious. He shoved Evans forward. "Clean it up. All of it. Useless." Evans scrambled, his hands shaking as he gathered the spilled rations. He grabbed the cigarettes, the cans. He hesitated over the dark bars. "Now, Private," Davis snapped. Evans scooped up 2 of the bars, but in his haste, his boot kicked the 3rd one. It skittered across the floorboards, coming to rest directly at Ilsa's feet. Davis glared at the bar, then at Ilsa. She was trembling, her eyes wide, locked on the small, forgotten rectangle. He seemed to have a war within himself, a flash of anger, then deep, profound weariness. He gestured sharply with his chin. "Leave it. Let's go." He turned and stalked out, Evans scrambling to follow. The door was pulled shut, and the heavy latch fell back into place. Silence descended again, heavier this time. Ilsa stared at the bar of chocolate. It was an impossible object in this place of gray wool and raw pine. Anki slowly uncurled, peering over the edge of her bunk. Her breathing was ragged, catching in her chest. Ilsa bent down, her fingers closing over the paper-wrapped bar. It was real. It was solid. She looked at Anki. The terror that had frozen, the girl's features began to crumble, replaced by a profound, shuddering confusion. Anka did not scream this time. She began to weep. Deep, gasping sobs that tore through the quiet of the barrack, not in fear, but in the face of an impossible, terrifying kindness. Anka's sobs subsided into ragged, hitching breaths in the cold darkness. The other women in Barrack C were awake now. Ilsa could feel their eyes. The rustle of straw mattresses, the sharp intake of breath. They were all witnesses to the impossible object that lay on the floor, gleaming faintly in the moonlight streaming through the high window. Ilsa's fingers tightened around the chocolate bar. It felt heavy, dense. "Do not touch it, Ilsa." Anka's voice was a terrified whisper from the bunk below. "It is poison. They trick us." From the far corner, another voice, older and rougher, cut through the gloom. "Poison? Worse, it is charity. They think we are dogs." Ilsa stood frozen. Poison. The thought was logical. It was what their own propaganda would have suggested, a cruel trick disguised as kindness. But her training as a nurse, her instinct for observation, warred with that fear. The bar was factory wrapped, U.S. Army issue. Poison was inefficient, theatrical. This was something else. She looked at the bar in her hand. Hershey's. The block letters were unfamiliar, but the implied meaning was universal. She thought of the last 2 years in Hamburg. The meager rations of watery turnip soup and coarse black bread that tasted more of sawdust than rye. She remembered the gaunt gray faces of the children in her ward, their bellies swollen not from food, but from the lack of it. Sugar was a myth, a memory from a world before the firebombing. "It is not poison," Ilsa said, her voice quiet but firm. She carried the chocolate bar to the window, angling it to catch the sliver of moonlight. She tore the paper wrapper carefully, clinically. The bar inside was dark, almost black, scored into precise rectangles. It smelled rich, slightly bitter, and overwhelmingly sweet. The scent alone felt like a violation of the barrack's atmosphere of lie and despair. "Ilsa, no," Anki pleaded. Ilsa broke off the smallest corner, a piece no larger than her fingernail. She looked at it. This concentration of enemy resources, this symbol of their utter defeat and the victor's casual abundance. She felt the eyes of the other women burning into her back. She placed the piece on her tongue. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, the warmth of her mouth began to melt it. A wave of intense, velvety bitterness, followed by a rush of pure, undiluted sugar, flooded her senses. It was overwhelming. It was the single most potent thing she had tasted in 3 years. A memory, sharp and unwelcome, pierced her. Christmas, 1938. Her father, his face smooth and unlined, handing her a small box of expensive truffles. A life so normal it now seemed like a fantasy. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and shameful. She was crying over sugar, while her country was in ruins. The kindness of the act felt almost as brutal as the cruelty she had expected. She swallowed. The thick sweetness coated her throat. It was not poison. Ilsa turned from the window. The other women were silent, their faces masked by shadows. She walked back to the bunk and held out the remaining larger portion of the chocolate bar to the darkness where Anki lay hidden. "Eat," she commanded, the single word thick with complex emotion. "It is just chocolate." A pale hand emerged from the blanket, trembling violently. Anka's fingers brushed Ilsa's, then closed around the offering. Ilsa heard a small, sharp crack as the girl broke off a piece, followed by a choked sob that was not of fear, nor of relief, but of a profound, shattering confusion. The rules had broken. The enemy had a face, and he had, accidentally or not, left them sugar. Ilsa climbed back into her bunk, the ghost of sweetness on her tongue, and understood that nothing would be simple again. The first Sunday arrived with a cold, metallic sky that promised rain but never delivered. The women of Barrack C were marched, not to a work detail, but to a long, clean building at the eastern edge of the compound. A simple, unadorned wooden cross was affixed above the double doors. Chapel. Attendance was mandatory. Ilsa's faith, once a quiet pillar of her life as a nurse, had become a dormant, private thing. It was a mechanism for internal survival, not a communal comfort. Now, it was being presented to her as a camp regulation. They filed in, their boots loud on the polished wooden floor. The interior smelled overwhelmingly of pine-scented floor wax and the faint, sweet scent of old hymnals. It was meticulously clean. Sunlight, thin and pale, streamed through tall, clear glass windows, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the air. The benches were hard, dark wood, worn smooth by years of use. A wide central aisle acted as a stark, uncrossable border. Ilsa guided Anki into a pew. On their side, 50 German women, a sea of gray work dresses, their hair pulled back severely. On the other side, perhaps 30 American soldiers, including Sergeant Davis, looking stiff and uncomfortable in their dress uniforms. Ilsa spotted Private Evans near the front, his youthful face scrubbed and serious. A few American civilians sat in the back rows, camp administrators and their wives, Ilsa presumed. Their faces were not hostile, merely curious, as if observing a zoological exhibit. The division felt absolute, a physical representation of the surrender documents. This was not shared worship. It was an exercise in structured observation. Ilsa focused on the grain of the wood in the bench before her, tracing its complex whorls with her eyes. The purpose she had gathered from camp rumors was not salvation. It was re-education, a civilized ritual meant to satisfy the Geneva Convention inspectors and gently nudge the vanquished toward their victors' morality. An American chaplain, an older man with a weary face and kind eyes, walked to the pulpit. He spoke in English. His voice was gentle, resonant, but the words were just sounds to Ilsa, a soothing but meaningless cadence. She felt Anka fidgeting beside her, the girl's terror from the first night having curdled into a sullen, restless boredom. The chaplain finished his remarks and nodded to a woman at a small, wheezing pump organ. The introductory notes were thin, airy, and heartbreakingly familiar. Ein fester Berg ist unser Gott. The Americans rose to their feet. Their voices were hesitant at first, then grew in volume, filling the space with English words. A mighty fortress is our God, a bulwark never failing. On Ilsa's side, there was only silence. The older woman beside her, the one who had scoffed at the chocolate, muttered propaganda under her breath. But the melody was Luther's. It was deeply, undeniably German. It was the song her grandmother used to hum while kneading dough. It belonged to them. Anka knew it too. Ilsa heard the girl take a small, surprised breath. Slowly, like hesitant birds testing the air, a few German voices began to rise. They did not, could not, sing the English words. They sang the words they knew. Ein feste Burg ist unser Gott, ein gute Wehr und Waffen. Ilse found her own voice joining in, rusty and low, the vibrations rising from her chest. The organ struggled to keep the two disparate groups together. For the space of 3 verses, the chapel was filled with a strange, dissonant harmony. English and German, victor and vanquished, guard and prisoner, all tracing the same ancient melody, separated by an aisle of polished wood. It was profoundly absurd. It was, Ilse admitted, almost beautiful. Her eyes drifted across the aisle. They met the gaze of Private Evans. He was not singing. He was watching her, his expression unreadable. He was the agent of their first shock, the boy who had brought the chocolate and the confusion. As the final chords of the hymn faded, the two languages dying into a shared, respectful silence, Evans held her gaze for a second longer than was proper. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. It was not forgiveness. It was not friendship. It was simpler and perhaps more powerful. It was recognition. Ilse looked away, back to the wooden bench. The wall was still there, high and thick, but she realized for the first time that it was not made of immutable stone. It was made of air and sound and ritual, and it could, perhaps, be breached. After a week of evaluations, the work assignments were posted. Ilse, with her nurse's background noted in a file, was not sent to the kitchens or the fields. She was assigned to the laundry. The laundry was a long, low building behind the mess hall, perpetually shrouded in a dense cloud of steam that smelled sharply of lye soap and boiling water. It was a realm of oppressive humidity and noise. The rhythmic thump-thump of the large belt-driven washing machines provided a dull backbeat to the hissing of steam presses and the chatter of the other women. Ilse's first task was sorting. A mountain of soiled clothing lay piled in the center of the concrete floor. It was all American. Khaki shirts, still damp with sweat and smelling of the men who wore them, rough denim trousers stained with mud, socks stiff with grime. This was the clothing of her enemy. Her hands, which had once tended to the wounds of her own soldiers, were now tasked with cleaning the uniforms of her captors. An older Aufseherin, a German overseer assigned by the Americans to manage the prisoner workforce, pointed her to the pile. Sort by material: khaki, denim, cotton whites. You are paid 2 cents per hour in scrip. Do not damage Army property. 2 cents. The humiliation was precise. Ilse pulled the first shirt from the pile. It was heavy, rough. She found a name stenciled above the pocket: Davis, S. She paused, the shirt held aloft. Sergeant Davis, the man with the gravel voice and impatient eyes. She could almost smell the faint, sour scent of his skin on the collar. She felt a surge of resentment so hot and sharp it nearly choked her. She wanted to tear the fabric in her hands. Instead, she threw it violently into the khaki bin. She worked for an hour in a grim, mechanical rhythm. Khaki, denim, undergarments. Each piece felt like a small surrender. This was worse than the chocolate, which had been a confusing gift. This was forced intimacy, a domestic servitude that solidified her position as the vanquished. Then, at the bottom of a large canvas hamper, she found them. They were heavy, folded into a tight square. She pulled the first one out, letting it unfurl. It was a white tablecloth. It was not the rough cotton of the uniforms, but fine, heavy linen, the kind her mother had used for Sunday dinners. It was stained with coffee rings, dark red wine, and greasy food splatters. It came, she realized, from the officers' club, a place of privilege she could not even imagine. She ran her fingers over the fabric. Even through the grime, she could feel the smooth, tight weave. She picked up another and another, a dozen of them. She stood very still, the chaotic noise of the laundry fading away. She buried her face in the bundle. The stains smelled of stale cigars and spilled liquor But beneath that, the fabric itself held the faint, clean scent of a life she had lost. A life with order, with dignity, with meals served on polished wood tables. A tear traced a clean path through the soot on her cheek, then another. She was not crying from fear, as she had with Anka, or from the shock of the chocolate. She was crying from a profound, aching homesickness. She spent the rest of the day at the great porcelain sinks, ignoring the khaki and the denim. She scrubbed those white tablecloths with a desperate, focused energy. She boiled them in the vats, her arms red to the elbows, heedless of the scalding water. She was a nurse again, and this was her patient. She would not stop until every last stain, every trace of the conqueror's feast was gone. When she finally fed the first one through the heavy steam press, it emerged stiff, gleaming, and absolutely perfectly white. It was a blank page. It was a small, reclaimed piece of her identity. She folded it with a precision that was almost reverent, the corners sharp, the surface smooth as glass. It was not his uniform. It was her work, and it was clean. The library was not a room. It was a glorified alcove, a 10 by 10 foot space curtained off from the back of the mess hall. It smelled of mildewed paper, stale coffee, and the faint, ever-present tang of pine oil soap. Its shelves were sparsely populated with donations from local churches and the YMCA, agricultural yearbooks, dozens of identical Bibles in German and English, and thick, unread theological treatises. Ilse went there not for comfort, but for strategy. The English language was a fortress wall. It was in the shouted, incomprehensible commands at roll call, the curt dismissal from the laundry, and the stark, black-stenciled rules tacked to the barrack door. Rule 7. No fraternization with guards. She knew that one by heart now, having pieced it together from context. But what of the others? What nuances was she missing that could protect Anki? What warnings was she failing to heed? She had found a discarded copy of the local newspaper, the Tullahoma News, on a mess hall table 2 days prior. She kept it hidden in her bunk, studying it at night. But the words were an impassive code. Bond Drive, Draft Board, Victory Gardens. They meant nothing to her. She sat on the hard wooden bench in the library alcove, the newspaper spread open. She was tracing the letters of a headline, "Local Soldier Honored Posthumously," when a shadow fell over the page. Ilse's entire body went rigid. She did not look up, but she knew the uniform. Private Evans stood in the entrance to the alcove. He was not on duty. He held no rifle, and his presence felt informal, almost accidental. He seemed surprised to find her there. Ilse immediately folded the newspaper, her cheeks hot, as if caught in a criminal act. She reached for a German Bible, placing it open in her lap, a shield of acceptable behavior. Evans did not speak. He seemed to understand the danger of Rule 7 as acutely as she did. He shuffled awkwardly, his eyes scanning the shelves. He seemed to be looking for something, but his search was aimless. He saw the newspaper she had folded by her side. His gaze lingered on it, then moved to her face. He saw the frustration, the desperate, silent effort. He looked away quickly. He moved to the small American shelf, which held perhaps 20 books. He picked one up, a thin volume with a faded blue cover. He idly fanned the pages, his expression carefully neutral. He could have been any bored soldier, killing time on a Sunday afternoon. He did not put the book back where he found it. Instead, he walked toward the exit of the alcove, passing the table where Ilse sat. In a single, fluid motion that was both deliberate and utterly deniable, he placed the book on the far end of her bench, spine up, and continued walking. He was gone before she could even process the gesture. She sat frozen for a long minute, her heart hammering. The alcove was silent again. This was not the chocolate, an impulsive, accidental offering. This was a conscious act. This was a breach. Her hands trembling, she reached for the book. The cover was cardboard, worn soft at the edges. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. A faded illustration showed a boy in a straw hat holding a fishing pole. She opened it. The paper was cheap, the print large and clear. She read the first line. Tom. She knew that word. It was a name. No answer. She parsed it. 9. Antwoord. She had heard the word answer during roll call. Tom. No answer. What's gone with that boy, I wonder? She did not understand gone or wonder, but she understood boy. Junge. This was not a newspaper. This was not a military manual. It was simple. It was a story. It was a key, offered by a hand that should have been closed against her. Ilse looked toward the empty doorway. She felt a sudden, terrifying surge of gratitude. It was a dangerous emotion, heavier and more complicating than fear. He had taken a risk. He had seen her not as Gefangene 304, but as a woman trying to read a newspaper. She slipped The Adventures of Tom Sawyer under her gray work dress, the hard corner of the book pressing like a secret against her ribs. She would learn. She would understand every word on those barrack walls. Ilse's English, nurtured in the shadows of the barrack by the flickering light of a stolen candle stub, had grown. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer had provided the scaffolding. The boy's simple grammar, I, you, go, river, became her foundation. From there, the newspapers she salvaged from the mess hall trash began to yield their secrets. She could now decipher the headlines, piecing together the broad strokes of a world that remained utterly alien. She was no longer just guessing. She was reading. She found the article folded on a bench near the laundry, left behind by a guard. It was from the Tullahoma News, dated November 5th, 1945. The war in Europe was over. The war in the Pacific was over. But the anger, it seemed, remained. It was not a news report. It was an editorial. A letter to the editor. Her fingers traced the black ink. It has come to this writer's attention that the German prisoners at Camp Forest are being treated not as the enemy who cost us so much blood, but as honored guests. While our sons and husbands eat powdered eggs in the mud of Okinawa or return home missing limbs, the Heine POWs are reported to be receiving fresh milk, butter, and American chocolate. Ilse's breath caught. The word was there. Chocolate. The anchor of her entire fragile new reality. The letter continued, the tone growing more venomous. We are told this is the Geneva Convention. I call it treason. My nephew, Billy Walker, died at Anzio. Who is giving his murderers fresh milk? These men and women, we are told, are the enemy. They should be treated as such. Hard labor and bread, not Sunday hymns and libraries. Ilse felt a cold sickness spread through her stomach. She read the passage again, and women, libraries. The writer was talking about her, about the hymn she had sung, about the book Evans had given her, the quiet, almost invisible thread of humanity that had begun to form. The nod in the chapel, the gift of the book, was not just a secret shared between two people. It was a public controversy. It was treason. She understood Sergeant Davis's permanent impatience now. He was not just managing prisoners. He was managing a town full of angry Billy Walkers. She was folding the newspaper, her hands shaking, when a commotion from the central compound made her look up. Sergeant Davis was standing outside the administration office, his voice a low, furious rumble that carried across the yard. Facing him, standing stiffly at attention, was Private Evans. Ilse could not make out all the words, but she heard enough. Too friendly? Regulations, Private. Complaints from town. Davis pointed toward Barrack Sienka, who had been sweeping the front steps, was frozen in place, clutching her broom. Beside her on the top step sat a single, bright red apple. Evans had given Anki an apple. "Not a damned holiday camp, Evans," Davis shouted, his voice cracking with rage. "You want to hold their hands? You want to write home and tell your mother you're coddling the women who cheered while our boys died? Get your head straight, or I'll have you cleaning latrines in Alaska. Am I clear?" "Sir, yes, sir." Evans' reply was a strained, humiliated mumble. Davis kicked the apple off the step. It rolled into the muddy yard. He glared at Anka, who flinched and ran back inside the barrack. Then he stormed back into his office, slamming the door. Evans remained at attention for a full 30 seconds, his face burning red, his eyes fixed on the middle distance. He did not look at Ilsa, though she knew he must have felt her watching. He turned, retrieved the muddy apple from the yard, and walked stiffly toward the motor pool. Ilsa crumpled the newspaper in her fist. The editorial was not just ink on paper, it was a weapon, and it had just been used against Evans. Her guilt was suffocating. Her small, secret pursuit of knowledge, her acceptance of the book and Anki's simple acceptance of an apple, these were not innocent. They had consequences. They had put the only guard who had shown them humanity in jeopardy. She would have to stop. She would return the book. She would not go to the library. She would not meet his eyes. The wall, which had seemed to thin, must be rebuilt. It was the only way to protect him. The cold snap of late November settled into the bones of the barrack. The brief, fragile warmth of the Sunday hymn felt a lifetime ago. After the editorial incident, a heavy silence had fallen over Barrack C. Ilsa had kept her promise to herself. She did not go near the library. She kept her eyes fixed on the soapy water of the laundry tubs or the gray wool of the blanket she mended. She had hidden The Adventures of Tom Sawyer under her mattress, the book feeling less like a key and more like an indictment. Anki had become more withdrawn than ever, her youthful resilience finally cracking, replaced by a quiet, hollow-eyed resignation. It was in the laundry that Ilsa first heard the word. Thanksgiving. The guard spoke it with a tone of anticipation, of travel, of food. It was clearly a holiday, but it held no meaning for her. It was just another American ritual, as alien as their chocolate or their casual abundance. But the word lodged in her mind. A day of thanks. For what? The mood in the barrack was at its lowest since the first night. The enforcement of the rules, under Sergeant Davis's renewed vigilance, was absolute. There were no more stray apples, no more lingering glances. Private Evans, when she saw him on patrol, was a perfect soldier. His face was a mask of professional indifference. He looked through her, his gaze sliding past her as if she were part of the fence. It was this coldness, ironically, that hurt more than Davis's overt anger. It felt like a deserved punishment. On the fourth Thursday of November, the camp routine was unchanged. Ilsa was on kitchen duty, assigned to peel a crate of turnips in the cold air outside the mess hall. The work was dull, her fingers numb. She watched Evans making his rounds, his footsteps precise in the gravel. He was walking toward her, past the small supply shed for Barrack C. He did not look at her. His eyes were fixed ahead. As he passed the corner of the shed, the small canvas sack he was carrying, a standard supply bag, seemed to catch on a protruding nail. Ilsa watched, holding her breath. The bag tore. A small cascade of white powder puffed into the air, followed by the dull thud of 3, then 4, potatoes hitting the dirt. Evans stopped. He cursed, a single sharp word under his breath. He looked back at the spilled goods, the dusting of flour on the ground, the potatoes rolling to a stop. He looked left, then right. His eyes met Ilsa's for a single, searing second. Then, with a visible tightening of his jaw, he abandoned the mess and continued his patrol, disappearing around the corner of the mess hall at a brisk walk. It was an accident. It was a snag on a nail. It was sloppy. It was utterly, completely deniable. It was the most deliberate act of defiance she had ever witnessed. He had not just broken the rules, he had shattered them, in broad daylight, in direct opposition to Davis's orders, and in response to her own fearful retreat. Ilsa's heart hammered against her ribs. She waited, scanning the compound. No one else was watching. She scurried from her bench, her hands scooping the precious, dirt-covered potatoes into the pocket of her apron. She used her hands to gather as much of the priceless white flour as she could, cupping it in the cloth. That night, Barrack C was not a cell. It was a conspiracy. With the hoarded kitchen grease they saved from their rations, the flour, and the boiled potatoes, Ilsa and the older woman, the one who had scoffed at the chocolate, worked in silence. They mashed the potatoes with salt. They mixed the flour with water and grease, forming a crude dough, which they baked on the flat top of the potbelly stove. It was not a feast. It was a thick, heavy potato bread and a spoonful of mash for each woman. But as Ilsa held the piece of warm, smoky bread in her hands, she understood the word: Thanksgiving. It was not about celebrating a victory. It was about acknowledging the harvest of a single, defiant kindness. It was giving thanks for a small bag of flour, accidentally spilled in the mud. December 24th, 1945. Camp Forest, Tennessee. 8 weeks. It had been 8 weeks since the first night, since the arrival in gray wool and the terror of the unknown. 8 weeks of laundry steam, lye soap, and the slow, agonizing reconstruction of a language. The air in Barrack C was colder than usual, the potbelly stove unequal to the task of fighting the Tennessee winter. But the smell was different. Ilsa breathed it in. Beneath the ever-present sense of damp wood and unwashed bodies, there was a sharp, clean fragrance. Pine. Anka, displaying a rare spark of her old self, had managed to break a small branch from a tree near the laundry shed. She had smuggled it inside, hiding it above the doorframe. It was a tiny, fragrant rebellion, a piece of the outside world, a symbol of Weihnachten. They sat on their bunks in the gloom. There were rumors of Christmas packages from the Red Cross, rumors of new prisoner lists, of potential transfers, or even repatriation for the non-combatant women. Hope, Ilsa found, was a far more painful emotion than fear. She was mending a tear in Anka's thin blanket when the sound came. A sharp, heavy knock on the wooden door. Ilsa's breath hitched. The needle stopped, poised in the air. The tin cup on the floor beside her rattled as a tremor ran through the floorboards. In the lower bunk, Anka let out the same choked whimper Ilsa remembered from that first night. The sound was identical. He buried her face in the thin mattress, her shoulders tensing. The knock came again, louder, more insistent. Ilsa rose from her bunk. She felt the cold floorboards beneath her feet. She moved, placing herself between the door and the younger girl. Her eyes darted to the camp regulations tacked to the wall, the ink blurred and faded, but the words still potent. Rule 7. But something was different. Ilsa's heart was pounding, a rabbit's terror against her ribs, but her mind was clear. This was Sergeant Davis. She knew his knock now. It was not the random prelude to violence she had once imagined. It was the sound of impatience, of bureaucracy, of lists. She steadied her voice, pitching it just loud enough for Anki. He is just bringing the list. She said it as much for herself as for the girl. It is only the list. The latch scraped open. The door swung wide. Sergeant Davis stood there, silhouetted against the yard lights. He looked tired, his shoulders slumped under his heavy coat. Behind him, almost hidden, stood Private Evans. Barrack C, Davis announced, his voice flat. He was holding a clipboard. "I have the mail call list. Answer when called." He was not looking at them. He was looking at his list, his duty. Evans, however, was looking directly at Ilsa. His face was pale in the cold, and he seemed nervous, shifting his weight. "Ilsa Koch," Davis called out. "Here," Ilsa said, her voice clear. "Anke Schmidt?" "Here," Ilsa answered for the trembling girl. Davis made 2 check marks. He tore a small voucher from the bottom of the page. "Package from the Red Cross. Pick up at the mess hall. AO 800 tomorrow." He handed the slip to Ilsa. As she reached for the paper, Evans stepped forward quickly from behind Davis's back. In his hands, he held something folded, a thick white square. "Sergeant," Evans said, his voice quiet, "this was in the damaged pile. From the laundry, marked for disposal. Barrack C's, I believe." Davis did not even turn. "Fine, Private. Get rid of it. Let's go." Evans pushed the object into Ilsa's free hand. Her fingers closed around it. It was fabric, stiff, heavy linen. It was one of the white tablecloths from the officers' club, this one with a small tear near the hem, rendering it damaged. He did not meet her eyes. He simply pressed the tablecloth into her hand, a transfer of contraband so swift and so smooth it was over before Davis had even finished turning. "Merry Christmas," Evans muttered, not to her, but to the air. He and Davis were gone. The door was pulled shut, the latch dropping back into place. Ilsa stood in the dark, the Red Cross voucher in one hand, the heavy, folded white tablecloth in the other. She heard Anke's breathing, still ragged. But this time, the girl was not crying. She was watching. Ilsa unfolded the linen. It was large, bright, and impossibly clean. She knew in that instant exactly what she had to do with it. They did not light a candle. The moonlight, amplified by a fresh dusting of snow on the ground outside, was enough. It streamed through the high windows, painting the floor in rectangles of pale blue. Ilsa held the white tablecloth. It felt heavy, a burden of impossible civility. The other women watched her, their faces etched with a mixture of weariness and fragile, hesitant curiosity. Anke had crept from her bunk, her bare feet silent on the floor, her eyes fixed on the linen. In the center of the barrack stood the long, rough-hewn table where they took their meager meals. Its surface was a map of their confinement, scarred with knife marks, dark stains, and the grain of raw pine. Ilsa walked to it. With Anke at her side, she unfolded the tablecloth. The sound it made in the quiet room was a soft whoosh, like a sail catching wind. They spread it over the rough wood, the heavy linen falling into place, its corners drooping almost to the floor. The transformation was immediate. It was shocking. The stark, perfect white of the cloth seemed to generate its own light, pushing the gray shadows back to the corners of the room. It was no longer a prison table. It was a foundation. It was a statement of dignity, so profound in its silence that it made the entire room hold its breath. For a long moment, the women just stared. The cloth was an accusation, reminding them of the homes and lives they had lost. Then, the oldest woman, the one who had scoffed at the chocolate 8 weeks ago, stood up. She walked to her bunk, reached under her mattress, and retrieved a small, carved wooden bird, no bigger than her thumb. She walked to the table and placed it gently in the very center of the white cloth. It was an offering. The spell was broken. Another woman, a quiet woman from Berlin, hurried to her bunk. She returned with the copy of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer Ilsa had been lending her. She placed it, covers closed, next to the bird, a piece of an alien world now shared. Anke, her eyes bright, ran to her own sparse belongings. She returned with the small, fragrant branch of pine. She laid it beside the book. Ilsa knew what she had to do. She went to her own bunk, retrieving the Red Cross voucher and the small, half-full tin box she kept hidden. Inside, wrapped in its original paper, was the last rectangle of the first Hershey's chocolate bar. She had been saving it. For what, she did not know. She walked back to the table and placed the chocolate, the book, and the pine branch on the crisp white tablecloth. The three anchors of her time here, a trinity of confusion, knowledge, and defiance. The women gathered around. They did not speak. There was nothing to say. Ilse looked at their faces, illuminated in the moonlight. She did not see enemies of the state or prisoners of war. She saw Greta, the cynical one. She saw Anka, the frightened one. She saw women, cold and hungry, trying to survive a winter far from home. From the far end of the table, a voice, cracked and thin, began to sing, "Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht." Another voice joined, then another. Ilse's own voice found the melody. They sang quietly, not for any guard or for God, but for each other. Outside in the snow, two figures stopped by the window of Barrack C. Sergeant Davis paused, his hand raised to knock, to enforce the lights out rule. He looked through the grime-streaked glass. He saw the scene. The women standing, the impossible white cloth, the pathetic, dignified offerings. He saw them not as prisoners, but as a silent, ordered tableau. Evan stood beside him, his breath fogging in the cold. Davis's raised hand wavered. He stared for a long, hard second. He had a wife in Georgia. He had a sister. He let his hand drop slowly, unclenched, to his side. He turned away from the window and continued his patrol, his boots crunching in the snow. Evans lingered. He looked past the glass, his eyes finding Ilse's. She was watching him. She did not smile. He did not smile. It was beyond that. He gave one sharp, definitive nod, the same nod he had given in the chapel. Recognition. Then he, too, turned and followed his sergeant into the cold. Ilse looked back at the table. The barrier was gone. It had not been torn down by force or by treaty. It had been dissolved by a bar of chocolate, a children's book, and a stolen piece of linen. She picked up the chocolate, broke it, and handed the first half to Anka.